Hi, everyone. My name is Khalil Cumberbatch. I am the Director of Engagement and Partnerships here at the Council on Criminal Justice. We're going to begin our program today, and I wanted to start off by thanking you all for attending this conversation that we have titled Beyond Borders, a conversation about immigration and crime. Uh, Today, we're going to be joined by three amazing speakers for whom I will get to in a minute. I wanted to just take a little bit of time to talk very briefly about the Council on Criminal Justice, and then, of course, to talk a little bit about Centering Justice, which is an initiative underneath the banner of CCJ. So, the Council on Criminal Justice is a think tank and a membership organization. We value ourselves in being a convener. We value the ability to have people gather to reflect and to discuss and sometimes disagree on pressing issues that face the field of criminal justice and the field of criminal justice reform. The organization was founded as an individual membership organization. And so we leverage the expertise and the experience of our individual members to weigh in on pressing issues that the criminal justice field faces. Obviously, today's conversation is one of those topics. The conversation on immigration and crime has continued to be a pressing one. We believe will continue to be a pressing and important one, given what is happening at the end of this year. And for those who may be hiding underneath a rock, we're talking about the upcoming presidential election. The issue of immigration has been in headlines nationally as well as locally, and we believe they will continue to do so closer to the day of election. Centering Justice is an initiative headed by myself and Mark, for which we strive to be the living embodiment of the purpose of CCJ, which is to really center the conversations around some of these pressing issues and really center it focused on the issue of justice, fairness, and equity. We believe that the criminal justice system should be fair, should be equitable, and it should be just, and that at a fair, just, and equitable criminal justice system is one of the true measures of how effective a society is in terms of treating its inhabitants or its citizens. Today, we are joined by three speakers, and we are extremely grateful for their time. Today, we are joined by Dr. Charis Kubrin, who is the professor of criminology, law, and society at UC Irvine. Ken Cuccinelli, who is the former acting deputy secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and Dara Lind, who is also joining us from, and I have lost the name of her organization. I'm so sorry, Dara.
American Immigration Council.
American Immigration Council. I did not want to butcher that, but I ended up doing it anyway. Thank you, Dara. Thank you, Deputy Secretary Cuccinelli, and thank you, Dr. Kubrin. Of course, I want to talk a little bit about my personal experience with the issue of immigration, and then I'll turn it over to Mark to just weigh in on some additional points before we begin. My journey in this great American story begins as an immigrant. My mother and I migrated here when I was 4 years old from our native country of Guyana, which is on the South American continent, bordered by Brazil. And we came to this country really with the dream of pursuing the ability to be free and to independent, and to just have the ability for my mother to raise her son safely. Because of a series of decisions that I made as a young man, I ultimately ended up getting convicted and serving 6.5 years in New York State prison. After my exit in 2010, I was home for about 4 years. And then in May of 2014, I was arrested by Immigration Customs Enforcement because of my criminal conviction, because of the fact that I was not a naturalized citizen. And it began a 5.5 month journey for myself in immigration detention to really win my freedom, to prove to the government that I was not a person who should be deported, and that I was actually going to be a benefit to my community and to society at large. And so, for that reason, the issue of immigration and crime, both very, very loaded terms, um, and I hope that we can get into some of the definition of those terms during this conversation, has been one that has always been very high for me, both personally and professionally. And again, I'm really grateful to the panelists today because they're going to be able to weigh in on both of those issues and do it from their professional perspective. So, Mark, I will turn it over to you to just say a few words before we kick it over to the panelists.
Thank you, Khalil, and your story certainly has inspired me and so many other people. And I just want to say at the outset, this discussion is so important to me because I think it helps us, first of all, be grateful that so many people want to come to this country and remember why that is. It's because of our freedoms, the rule of law, private property rights, the ability to speak freely, to free exercise of religion, economic opportunity, really the idea that America is an idea. It's not about blood and soil, and we don't define being an American by somebody's skin color, religion, or anything else. And so, that being said, obviously there's limits in how many people can be integrated within a certain geography and time period, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But I think, the rule of law is so important. The idea that, if you have a legal case or you have an issue with the government, it's not going to be decided based on who you know, which obviously sometimes we do have corruption and problems with that, and it gets prosecuted. But you're gonna have a fair shot and a fair shake. And I think that's you don't have to give money to a cartel to be protected by the police or whoever's acting as the police in that particular area. So that's something that I think so many immigrants, when they do come here, they have such an appreciation for, and it's something that's a work in progress that we all have to continue as citizens to safeguard zealously. So it's no secret there's been a number of high-profile incidents involving people here illegally who committed, in some cases, serious crimes, and certainly those are very sobering. We also know it's important from our general work on criminal justice to put individual experiences into a broader context, including using the best data to evaluate complex policy challenges. And we also know that the media doesn't cover, understandably so, the planes that land safely. All the people here, whether legally or illegally, who are doing things positive to contribute to our society. But I think another thing just that I'll point out before we begin is the fact that in the area we focus primarily on criminal justice, we had the First Step Act, we had landmark progress, we've had dozens of states pursue justice reinvestment and be able to both lower crime and reduce their prison populations. But in immigration, we've had what I think perhaps all our speakers will agree on, decades of dysfunction, of gridlock, of really leaving in place a policy that I think in some ways people across the spectrum agree is in many cases irrational and ineffective. So I'm hoping today's discussion will contribute to moving us forward, but certainly it's a problem that's so complicated it will take much more than one conversation to solve. But I wanted to start by just laying the groundwork in terms of the data. The question being, what do we know? And I think we don't have perfect knowledge, suffice to say. And what do we know about the connection between immigration and crime? And Professor Kubrin's done a great deal of research on this subject. So I wanted to turn to her to just kind of give us the lay of the land of what the limited data we have tells us about whether immigrants commit more or fewer crimes than native-born citizens, and some of the specific issues involving various types of crimes and so forth. So Professor Kubrin, go right ahead.
Thanks, Mark, and a big thanks to CCJ for having this important conversation. It's obviously very timely, and I think the consequences are critical. So I'm really pleased to be a part of it. So, and I do like that we start with a data question. I do like that we're starting by asking, what do we know? What do the empirical data show on this topic? And as Mark said, last year I published a book with my collaborator, Graham Owsey, titled Immigration and Crime Taking Stock. And I mention that because not only have I done work in this area, but hundreds of other scholars have. Over the decades, we've amassed lots of information on the relationship between immigration and crime. And in this book, we review all of that information. And so just in a nutshell, there's really two questions that people want answers to on this topic. The first is, are immigrants more likely than the native born to commit crime? That's really an immigrant offending relationship question. And then also, does immigration adversely affect the crime rate? And that's really an immigration and crime relationship question. And what we know from decades and decades of research is that the majority of studies which focus on this question of immigrant offending find that immigrants are actually engaging in offending at lower rates than their native-born peers. And this is often surprising to folks, but that's what the data say across different surveys and using official data. If we turn to the immigration crime nexus, research on this relationship across neighborhoods, cities, metropolitan areas, and even states reveals that immigration has either no impact on crime or causes crime to go down. And prior to writing this book, Graham and I published what's called a meta-analysis of this broader immigration crime relationship, where we did a quantitative assessment of all these findings. What we found, again, is that the relationship is most often null, but when there was a significant relationship, it was 2.5 times more likely to be negative than positive. In other words, immigration goes up, crime goes down. So while there's some nuances to that, that's kind of what the literature has to say as a whole. And that's often in contrast to what you hear about in the news or in public discourse.
And can I just follow up and ask you, when we say crime, I assume we're talking about index crimes, which property, violent. And so, of course, as you know, we've seen specifically when a bunch of migrants end up in a specific place at a particular time, you can have issues of, now, of course, with the recent Supreme Court decision, sleeping in the street might be a crime, trespassing, other types of things that aren't index crimes, but kind of make many people unsettled in terms of quality of life issues. And of course, in fairness, we should point out a lot of people who are here undocumented. Of course, they're not able to legally work, and so that, and then many of them are kind of, for various reasons, end up being in a place that just doesn't have enough services to deal with the flow and enough housing, which we know is a problem even for those of us who are citizens. Many people have struggle finding affordable housing. So could you address kind of the quality of life type crime that may not show up in the statistics?
Sure. And first, to answer your original question is that, yeah, the studies that we review focus on FBI index crimes. So we're talking about violent crimes, so murder, rape, robbery, and assault, but as well as property crimes like burglary, larceny, and auto theft. Now, it's much more difficult to get data at a national level on the public disorder type things that you're describing. We do know from the public health literature that if you look at other outcomes like drugs and alcohol, again, immigrants tend to fare better than their native-born counterparts. And this happens across so many different outcomes that there's a term in the literature that's often referred to as the immigrant paradox, because we often expect immigrants, given the challenges that they face, to be engaging in higher rates of crime, higher rates of drug and alcohol abuse, but on average, we find that they are less likely compared to their native-born counterparts. And this poses an interesting paradox or puzzle that researchers are still trying to explain today. In terms of things like homelessness and other public disorder type things, we don't have data on that on a national level to be able to address those questions in any systematic way, but they certainly are important questions to be asking.
Thank you, Dr. Kubrin, and I want to bring in Dara and, of course, Ken. Before we do that, I just want to mention that this event is being recorded. This is a LinkedIn audio event that is being recorded. Like our previous LinkedIn audio events, this will ultimately be up on the Centering Justice page. So please just be mindful of that. I should also say that we will be taking questions and answer at the end of the event. And so please follow and message the Council on Criminal Justice LinkedIn with any of the questions. We will try to get through as many of them as we can. And of course, for all in attendance, we are really happy to be joined by our colleagues in media. And so they are on the call, and this convo is being recorded. So obviously, this is all on the record. Media can follow up with any additional questions via email, for which we'll make sure that we'll put one of the email addresses in the chat before we all end. So I want to open up the same question to obviously Dara and former Deputy Secretary Cuccinelli. So whoever wants to join first, again, the question is, what is the relationship between immigration and crime, and between illegal immigration and crime?
So this is Ken, and I appreciate the professor's quick walkthrough. Before I went to the dark side and went to law school, I was an engineer, so I have a great appreciation for data. Certainly one of the frustrations in this space that I experienced very directly and quite intentionally when I was at DHS was the intentional blockage of data by many jurisdictions when it comes to immigration, particularly illegal immigration, to be most specific. And so it makes the analysis, especially at the national level, a lot more difficult. I would note, to dovetail Mark's question about that touched on things like quality of life, cost of living, and so forth, that it's worth remembering we're talking about one aspect of immigration impacts. And yes, I recognize that it gets a lot of press when folks who are here illegally commit further crimes. And of course, coming here illegally is itself a crime. But until, if you go back 10 years, and I'm guesstimating there a little bit, prior to that, most of the people here illegally came on a legal visa and stayed. Now, most people are crossing into the country illegally and staying. And so there's a difference between who's willing to commit an initial crime to come here. And of course, none of that criminal activity is accounted for in the data we're discussing here. I would note that if you look at this from the perspective of American citizens who are the sovereigns in this country, that the rate of crime by those coming particularly illegally, there's a difference between legal and illegal that's very significant. That simply being that folks coming here and who are present here legally are effectively invited to be here by the American citizens through their government. Unfortunately, we're literally in the tens of millions of illegals. We've added 10 million more under the Biden administration, and they were not invited here. And so every crime committed by anyone in that category is a crime that should have been prevented with border security or the enforcement of our immigration laws. So I look at this from a more raw data perspective. And I'm curious about the professor's comment about crime going down. I assume she was referring to the crime rate going down. 2.5 times more likely to go down than up was the number I heard. But I assume we're talking about the rate there, that you still more immigrants, whether they be legal or illegal, equals more crime on a raw basis. And that affects American citizens here. And if we are able to distinguish between the two groups of legal and illegal, then the news from Professor Kubrin looks really very good. It looks entirely tolerable to be having invitees of our country committing crimes at a lower rate. People are people, and in large numbers, you're going to have some crime. But if those rates are below the rate for the rest of the population here, that suggests that that particular feature of the legal immigrant community doesn't really require a great deal of addressing. Now, I would note that one of the things that has gotten worse and worse under the current administration, and we'll talk about this when we get to policies, is it's one thing to have crime committed. It's quite another, especially more severe crimes, to then have localities and states protect that criminal, who is also an illegal alien, from deportation. And having been an attorney general before I was at the Department of Homeland Security, I can tell you that the 80-20 rule generally holds for crime. 80% of the crime tends to be committed by about 20% of the criminals. Why that has held for so long, I don't know, but it has held pretty well over the course of the last 2, 3, 4 decades. And so when you have someone who demonstrates a willingness to commit a crime who's also here illegally, why on earth anybody would not move to immediately have deportation going on? And let's take Khalil, who's on with us here. He was here legally. The starting point is different, and it matters. I appreciate that he went through the process and stayed. And in some other instances, that process will lead to people not staying. And I trust the process. I don't think it's perfect. It's set up by people, and it's run by people, and we're all fallible. But I would circle back. I don't want to dominate this too long. I'm going to hand it off to Dara. That the raw number of crimes committed, particularly as it relates to the meaning for crime victims to non-illegal immigrants, is a great concern, because those are all preventable if we're enforcing our immigration laws. And we are not. We have never enforced them 100% ever. And I don't expect we ever will. But the difference matters to the quality of life and the safety of American citizens. With that, I'll hand it over.
Thank you. And yeah, I very much appreciate the way that Acting Deputy Secretary Cuccinelli phrased this, because it gets to what I think is a really important thing to say explicitly when we're talking about immigration, which is that immigration is a policy issue, but it's one that has really high normative stakes for who we are as a country. And so when we're talking about specifics in immigration policy, in descriptive trends, we often see a kind of melding of, empirical arguments and normative arguments, or empirical arguments that are kind of standing in for normative arguments. Like if immigrants are committing fewer crimes, then they must be good for communities, or if more crimes than bad for communities, is the implication, but we're not explicitly saying, okay, we're not looking at the other aspects of immigration, the other impacts as has been mentioned. And so it tends to take on a bigger role because of these kind of unspoken normative implications. In particular, I want to dig in on this kind of passing assertion that there have been 10 million additional people added to the U.S. unauthorized population under the current president, because there's a few things with that. One, it's a reminder that the major metric we use in immigration enforcement is apprehensions at the U.S.-Mexico border month by month, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense from a criminological perspective, right? If we're looking at, it would be like counting the number of arrests instead of the crime rate, especially because many of those people are not, certainly not all of them, and often, often not even a majority, but certainly many of them are being detained and deported. So the major metric that we use is a reflection of how many people were able to set foot on US soil. That's especially relevant because just kind of talking through what has happened, the kind of modal way that people come to the US without papers over the last 10 years is that they present themselves to a Border Patrol agent and they express that they wish to seek asylum in the United States, or when asked if they fear persecution, they say that they do fear persecution. That means simultaneously, and I'm really sorry about this, y'all, but it's the way immigration law works. Simultaneously, they have committed a crime by entering between ports of entry without authorization, and that they are seeking a legal status in the United States. And so most of what the cases in which people are on the streets in major cities, for example, most of those people have been given at some point a notice to appear in immigration court, either way down the road or they don't even have a date yet, because that legal process is in the process of getting resolved. I think that that's really important when we talk about the question of whether people who come here without authorization are more likely to commit crimes, because that's an unspoken, like I was saying earlier, normative implication in what Acting Deputy Secretary Cuccinelli was saying was that, the reason that we should be more concerned about people without authorization is that they've demonstrated the willingness to break the law once. That's not necessarily the case with people who have come for the purpose of seeking asylum, much less some of the other things that have been treated as an increase in the unauthorized population by immigration hawks under President Biden, such as the use of the CBP-1 app to make appointments at ports to present themselves for asylum, or parole programs, which allow people to fly into the United States with prior authorization. In both those cases, there isn't actually a law being broken, but because it gets into a bigger question of, did Congress explicitly authorize that these people should come, it's still treated often kind of casually as if they're the same thing. So if we're talking about who is more likely to willingly circumvent the law, that's not necessarily someone who is presenting themselves to a Border Patrol agent. That is someone who is trying to enter entirely without inspection, who is trying to, fly entirely under the radar, something that's less true or less likely to be true now than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And what we know about, criminologically, again, is when you increase enforcement, you will deter offending on the margin. You will especially deter offending among kind of casual offenders. The people you are least likely to deter are the people who are most committed to criminal activity. So the idea that increased border enforcement would, certainly would zero out the commissions of crime by unauthorized immigrants, or even that it would, have a linear impact that every person you're deterring from coming to the US is a fraction of crime you are preventing, needs to come face to face with the fact that the people who are coming and presenting themselves to Border Patrol agents and the people who are coming and, for the purpose of engaging in criminal activity here are not necessarily overlapping populations, and you're more likely to deter the former than the latter with crackdowns and border policy.
Can I chime in and respond to all of this? Because I think this is a great start to the conversation. So I want to just respond to Mr. Cuccinelli's comment about undocumented immigration. We have an entire chapter in the book that reveals every study that's ever been done on both undocumented immigrants and their offending rates and undocumented immigration and crime. And the really fascinating finding from this chapter, sort of in a collective, is that the findings are the same. So when we look at specifically undocumented immigrants, we see either a null effect or no effect on the crime rate. But the reason why it's so important to start with the data and the facts is because that's what should drive policy decisions. When we see doctors and a doctor is prescribing, a treatment for us, we hope that the doctor is making the decision for our treatment on what the research literature says, right? On hundreds, if not thousands of studies, whether it's, related to the heart or what have you. In the same way, our criminal justice policy, and by the way, if they don't, and they're making suggestions based on their individual thoughts or their feelings about it, we would consider that correction medical quackery. In the same way, our criminal justice system should be taking the evidence about what we know about any topic in crime, whether it's policing or immigration, and making policy decisions based on what the data have to say, because if not, that's what we would call, say, correctional quackery. And I do think in the area of immigration, that is one of the areas where the policies are not always matching up, and indeed are often going in the opposite direction of what we see in the data. And as a criminologist, someone who studied crime for 25 years, my point on this, whether it's immigration, policing, any topic, is that if we actually care about crime and we care about reducing crime, in the case of immigration, getting really tough on immigrants is actually not going to change the crime rate in any significant way if the data, are speaking, which they are on this. So my thing is like, yes, I would love to see crime go down. We should be concerned about crime when it's rising. But the very harsh, restrictive, and exclusionary immigration-related policies that have been offered up decade after decade really are not going to have much impact on crime. And that's what the research shows. So, and back to Dara's point about the enforcement not being the only solution, I would absolutely agree with that. Enforcement has to be a part of the solution, but it can't be the only part of the solution, especially because when we look at why people are coming to the United States, it is for so many myriad reasons that are much bigger than an individual thinks that they can get away with coming to the United States illegally. There are forces much bigger than that are compelling not just hundreds, but thousands of individuals to want to flee their home countries and go somewhere safe where they can secure income for their family. So toughening up this or that is not going to stop those trends, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Kubrin. I do want to transfer us into the conversation about how all of this impacts policy. So thank you for that segue, Dr. Kubrin. I do think that it is, however, important for us to just touch on one particular point of migration, and that is the exploitation of migrants. We all know that people who come here undocumented are largely exposed to all types of atrocities, some of which we have heard, some reporting on, and many of which we probably have not. I would like to just ask this question, and just for the sake of time, if we can make this one short answers, so then we can move into the policy part of the conversation. But how should we address the exploitation of migrants, including but also not limited to the issue of human trafficking? And anyone can start.
So this is Ken. That it's hard to do that one short, but I'll do the short version. The pipelines that are the current, trafficking pipes for human trafficking are duplicative and controlled by the cartels based in Mexico primarily. And those exact same pipelines are used to move drugs in here. And they use the flow of humans to mask the flow of drugs pretty effectively. And so you can't separate all of these out. We're dealing with one variable of a multivariable equation. And we want to find areas of agreement. One, I think that we can agree on, that I've heard both of my fellow speakers speak to, is that enforcement alone is not a solution to the crime aspect of the problem, that it is more complicated than that. And I would certainly agree with that. I would point out on this, just the pipeline question, coming through those pipelines are a ton of drugs that in 2021 and 2022 killed over 70,000 Americans just with the fentanyl. And the street price of those drugs has plummeted with the open border. And while we want our fellow Americans to stop using illegal drugs, and we have to put effort into that, at the same time, there is a brutal law of supply and demand here. And these pipelines are being used for the human trafficking as well. And it's hard to get numbers because, of course, these are criminal enterprises. But the belief is that several of these cartels in the last few years have passed the money they make in drugs with the money they make in the human trafficking side. So, all of this is funding the most evil, vicious people in the Western Hemisphere. And Americans don't see the death and destruction that that's wreaking below the southern border. It is horrific. And we're contributing to that. We're contributing to it, one, with our demand for drugs, but we're also adding to it by opening our border and essentially juicing up their business.
I agree absolutely that the same operators are making money off illegal trafficking of like illegal smuggling of people, of drugs. In elsewhere in the hemisphere, you have stuff like illegal wildlife and lumber that are also the same groups. I think it's easy to overread that when it comes to kind of the operational details in the United States. For example, we have continued to see that in general, drug seizures at the border are more likely to happen at ports of entry. And the fact that that continues to be true after years, it's not that smugglers are stupid and don't change their behavior. Quite the contrary, they change their behavior in response to incentives. And the fact that that continues to be true suggests that more drugs are getting through at ports of entry than are getting through between, because that's just where you can it's easier to drive an enormous truck through an actual road than it is to, try to transport that volume of drugs through the desert. That said, it is an enormous challenge, and it's also something of a policy opportunity in a world in which in a world in which the primary objective of immigration policy was to shut down transnational crime. You'd have to have a really aggressive foreign policy component to it, because this gets into the extent to which other countries in the hemisphere do not have the same rule of law as the United States, and do not have to a certain extent governments that have been compromised by criminal organizations. Peru literally just passed, its legislature just endorsed a law that would prevent prosecutors from investigating smuggling as a crime. But it also would, if you think about things from what we know in criminal justice, if you're trying to disrupt a large criminal organization and you want to get the people at the top, you flip the people on the bottom. You learn about who these people who are directing everything are and how they work by bringing in low-level operators and getting them to cooperate. And that tees up another really important aspect of, the relationship between immigration and crime, which is the extent to which immigrants, as potential victims and potential witnesses of crime, are able to cooperate with American law enforcement. And that is actually a problem that Congress has acknowledged, that people are less likely to come forward if they're concerned about their own legal status, if they're incurring the wrath of really powerful criminal organizations. They still have relatives back home who can be targeted. And Congress has created a couple of visas specifically for victims of trafficking, victims of gender-based violence. And so, and those have become, unfortunately, tremendously backlogged to an extent that it's difficult to even say that they're working. But it's a reflection of the fact that that problem has been acknowledged, that it's really hard to get the people at the top of an organization if your most obvious entry points, which are the victims or the people who at worst are at the low levels of the organization, have absolutely no reason to even identify themselves to you.
Thank you, Dara.
Yep.
Dr. Kubrin?
Yeah, I'll be quick on this. I really do appreciate the level of detail when we talk about issues around immigration that need fixing or that we need to discuss. I appreciate when we get into the specifics and in the weeds. The problem is a lot of the national conversation is at a very base level. Are immigration and crime related? Immigrants commit crime. It's a quite different national narrative that really paints a problem on a broad scale. Whereas what we're talking about now are identifying the specific problem points, whether it's specific aspects of the border policy or our immigration policy that need fixing. And so what I'd like to see is a movement away from this broad national narrative that just paints immigration as a huge national problem where crime is just, left, right, and center as a result of immigration, to these narrow talks. focusing on things like exploitation, victimization of immigrants, and other issues allows us to reframe the conversation away from this broad narrative and get to what's really ailing the United States. And I think that allows us to see clearly what the issues are and not get caught up in a lot of the rhetoric that I think we see just on a daily basis around immigration and crime.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I was going to kind of transition us hopefully to the solutions section, and kind of ask about, the idea of if, let's say, the same people that are coming now undocumented were able to apply to come here in their home countries. Now, of course, there's some that are fleeing an emergency where they're under, feel like they could be killed the next day and that sort of thing. But putting that aside, that ostensibly, of course, if they were applying to come here legally, they would be screened for criminal background check and whether they had a criminal record in their own country. And Dr. Cooper and you're the expert on data. I assume we probably don't know of the immigrants that are undocumented here that do commit a serious crime, what percentage of them had a criminal record in their originating country. I assume we don't know that, but we would probably all agree that if we could, the people who recently committed a serious crime in their home country are at a greater risk of doing so here. So I guess the question is part of the solutions here making it so that a greater share of the people that come here, I think, Ken, you acknowledge it's not going to be 100%, but a greater share could apply under theoretically a more streamlined set of laws maybe than we have now from their home country. But please, any of you want to go from that, but also other potential solutions to the problem we've been discussing, regardless of obviously the rate or the raw data. We would all like less crime and we would like a more functional immigration system.
So we can agree on that. I would also point out that, yes, it's obviously valuable as a nation, the most generous immigration nation in the world, the United States, to know who wants to come here and for us to decide, yes, this person can come, no, that person can't come. The originating countries have wildly varying motivations to cooperate or not with us. And some of them simply aren't capable of it. I'll take an extreme example like Syria. I mean, there is no functioning government that's running, they can offer you a criminal background history on somebody coming from Syria. And there are other countries in that same position. But my own view is that in those instances, you start by protecting America, and those people can't come. It's a condition of entry because of what you just said, Mark, is, it's one thing to have aspiring people who support the rule of law coming, and they'll add to the fabric of America consistent with our founding principles. But if you're someone who's been committing crimes in your home country, there's not a lot of reason for us to run the risk of you not doing that suddenly here. So, but our access to that information is very spotty, very unreliable, and very difficult to use. So there's a bit of a dice roll anytime you go into this. And when we try to solve these problems, I'll use one of the visas that Dara referenced. She didn't name this one, but the U visa. There's 10,000 a year, as I recall. I'm doing this from memory, so don't hold me to it for gospel. But Los Angeles alone applies for a sixth of them every year. And they're intended to protect folks who are not here legally, but who have been crime victims and who are helping solve the crime. They're a witness, or typically a witness or a crime victim. Well, what we immediately found is that jurisdictions like Los Angeles literally set up offices to crunch out these visa applications, and they never prosecute the vast majority of these cases. So each tool gets abused within the United States by those in the United States who have a more extreme open borders perspective, then they use these tools to achieve that ultimate goal, even though it's inconsistent with why the tool was set up. So we end up with all kinds of problems like that. And a similar one, asylum was mentioned about people coming not through legal ports of entry. I would suggest to you that as a simple matter of logic, that if someone has a sincere asylum claim and they're breaking into the country illegally, they don't actually have a sincere asylum claim. You take that through the channels that exist to do it, and you can show up on the exact same day at a legal port of entry if you think you've got a real asylum claim. And so that system is badly abused. The career asylum officers, and these are people there year after year, regardless of who the administration is, are granting just over a quarter of these on a regular basis. Again, my data is old from when I was there, and it looks back about 8 or 10 years from when I was there till 2020, end of 2020 or so. I can't get down to that level of nuance for the last couple of years, but it's not a high percentage. Asylum in most of our lives was for places like the Soviet Union, Cuba, etc. But you've got countries like Venezuela that just like Cuba did in the late 70s, they use our immigration system to do strategic harm to the United States and to benefit themselves. So there's an awful lot of other variables that come into play here.
So it's actually just not true that you can walk up the same day to a U.S. port of entry and apply for asylum.
In fact, it is. I've been at the U.S. ports of entry.
Yeah, the Biden administration, following the past two administrations, has done what's called hardening and enlisted Mexican law enforcement officials so that you cannot physically approach the port of entry without demonstrating that you have either papers or an appointment. And the appointment part is I mentioned in passing the use of the CBP One app to make those appointments. There are a limited number of appointments available, and the wait time is measured in months. So we have people who are waiting and I've talked to them, who are waiting for months in northern Mexico for the chance to see if they've won the lottery to get an appointment. And yet has that program, that app has itself been, litigated as a quote unquote open borders policy because it allows people to present themselves for asylum who haven't been pre-selected. So it gets into, what I said at the outset, the idea that the rule of law actually means different things to different people. That something like that, which theoretically is on the side of we can pre-monitor somebody, we can, we know who's coming in, can also be seen as an undermining of the rule of law because it has the monitoring side, but it doesn't have the kind of active pre-selecting, we've decided that you are one of the most worthy people. Another example of that is just that refugee resettlement has been, the U.S. doesn't have the same amount of infrastructure everywhere. And actually what we've seen over the last year is that the Biden administration has started to, Mark, you mentioned the idea of people being able to apply, in their home countries. The Biden administration has set up a few what are called safe mobility offices, which are intended to make people aware of what their options are to migrate to the U.S. legally, and if they are eligible for refugee status, which is the same kind of persecution grounds as is used for an asylum claim in the U.S., that they can be processed. And that has resulted in a really meaningful increase in the number of Latin American refugees who are being resettled in the U.S. because the State Department just hasn't put energy into the Western Hemisphere. You can see that just as easily in the fact that there are the kind of governance issues that I mentioned earlier, right? The governments that are in bed enough with criminal organizations that they're thwarting investigations into them may not be, the most responsible in communicating whether or not someone has a criminal record, and may have criminalized someone for exercising what we would in the US consider First Amendment rights, right? The question, we don't want to allow anyone who is from a non-cooperating country to come because they might have a criminal record. Well, the flip side of that is that the people who are working the hardest to leave countries because they disagree with their government, because they feel it's really important to be able to express their political views, are the ones who are, arguably the kind of the immigrants who Mark and Khalil were talking about at the beginning, who value the U.S. for its rule of law. And yet, the more skepticism you build into the system, the harder you make it. I think it's really important to note that, yes, in general, I think we all agree that that if you make it easier to do something legally, fewer people will do it illegally. But I think the fact that we're getting to these questions over implementation, and, I understand that this is much more nuanced than the national conversation typically is, but I'm trying to be the change here by giving people a little more information than they're going to get on cable news. I think that this really demonstrates that it's not quite as simple as, well, we all agree on the general principle, that the implementation details can be where these normative differences really come out.
Can I just say one thing, and I know we need to move to questions, but what's really missing from this conversation are the incentives for folks to come to the United States. Our economy is dependent upon low-wage labor, and immigrants provide a major source of that low-wage labor. So there's lots of incentives among business owners of all kinds to keep immigrants coming to this country so that they are able to, populate the jobs that are needed to make America run. But my last point on the policy thing, I think, is I don't know what the right policy is. My larger point that I hope folks take away today is we have to be careful about the wrong policy. And I do think the last several decades have reflected a series of policies, whether it's criminalizing immigrant status, so like Arizona's SB 1070, or policies that reflect the devolution of immigration enforcement like 287G or secure communities. These policies and programs, I think, are not getting the crime-reducing returns that they were claimed to promise, A, but B, they have a series of collateral consequences that I think in the end actually hurt things even more. And whether that's separating out families or leaving those of deported, folks that are deported behind, whether it's lawsuits for police departments that are attempting to identify who undocumented immigrants are, you name it, there's just a series of collateral consequences from 287G programs and security community programs. We have a policy chapter on this on the book that says it's not just reducing crime, but it could be adding to additional problems, including inequality in our society. So I think it's important to weigh that as well in any policy discussion.
Yeah, if I could do a dovetail comment on that, and that is an observation, really. In the summer of 2019, some of you may recall the large ICE operation. I want to say it was in Mississippi, and it's some chicken factories, and over 600 illegal aliens were picked up, but also the company and some of its managers were prosecuted. And I was really interested to see the reaction to that there was really bipartisan support for the enforcement when it included the Americans who were taking advantage of the system, the businesses who were exploiting people, really. And for anybody who thinks these are jobs Americans won't do, they promptly held a job fair and they were swamped with local Americans who would do the jobs and who were grateful to do it. I would point out that large-scale, low-wage immigration, whether it's legal or illegal, and right in this stage of our history, it's been illegal, hurts American poor people. The General Accounting Office has found that, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights has found that, the National Research Council has found that, and that should not surprise anyone. It's simply the law of supply and demand. When our own poor people are in greater demand, their wages go up. And that has been observed for a long, long time. The data is very clear on that. And when I think about the fact that my first concern is for Americans and those legally present here when it comes to crime and protecting them from any of it, whether it's a lower rate by illegals or not, combined with preserving their economic opportunity, there is a case to be made to, as best we can, scale down as close to zero as we can get illegal immigration. That leaves us with actually a cleaner discussion on legal immigration. We're much better positioned to have it at that point.
Thank you, former Acting DepSec Cuccinelli, and thank you all again for your answers. We are running close on time, and we definitely want to make time for as many questions as possible. This has been a very engaging conversation, and of course, an hour is never enough time. So we do have a couple questions coming in. Obviously, with 4 or 5 minutes left, please make your answers as brief as possible, but they are very loaded questions. I will give you that heads up. So the next question I'll pose it is just if we can do it as a two-part. First part would be great if we can just answer with a yes or no, and then name one specific way in which we can find this. And that first part is, are there any areas for future bipartisan progress on the issue of immigration? And again, if the answer is yes, please give some definitive ways or one way in which we can achieve that. And then the second part of that question, or the second part, not necessarily part of the same question, is what strategies can be deployed to prevent infrastructure strain and maintain safety in communities that face a significant influx of immigrants, while still providing, obviously, the necessary support and safety for immigrant populations. I did give you the warning it would be a loaded question.
Wow.
So please try to keep the answers as short as possible if you can.
Yeah, I'll actually take the second one first. What we've seen with the resource crunches in major cities over the last couple of years is a function of a couple of things. One, the federal government does not think it's anyone in particular's responsibility to make sure that immigrants who are waiting hearings before an immigration judge to make sure that they can feed themselves and have somewhere to live in the meantime and in the time before they're able to work in the US legally. That problem hasn't really been a major visible issue because in the past, most people who have come have had some form of network that they were able to activate, somebody that they could stay with, etc. As the flow of migrants into the US has become more diverse, more people haven't known anybody. And so you've had these people who can't work legally, don't have anywhere to live. The federal government has done a little teeny bit in terms of FEMA grants to try to bridge that gap. But the problem fundamentally is that states and localities are the ones responsible for the kind of day-to-day care and feeding issues, as well as preventing any kind of negative spillover effects that would be associated with the kind of, quality of life issues or other public safety issues on US citizens. But the federal government hasn't explicitly told them it's their job, much less given them any of the tools that would be required to make that less of an issue.
So we found a point of agreement. There are plenty. This is one. I would note that it isn't just cities. It's people don't cross into this country or stay here illegally in a level fashion. There are communities and cities in, South Arizona, South Texas, New Mexico, California, Florida, that have higher densities of this population. And so you end up with more of those local and state costs that, as Dara said, and I agree, are carried not by the federal government. And there's no real accounting for that. Going back to the first question, I identified one area of enforcement that I told you all I was surprised to see the sort of bipartisan support for it. I'll identify another one that was talked about briefly, and that is the ports of entry. There's a technology or a category of it called non-intrusive technology, which think of it simply like that scanner you go through at TSA, but for vehicles at ports of entry. And there's bipartisan support to reach 100% search level at those legal ports of entry. And I'm not talking about just the Mexican border. I'm talking about all of our ports of entry now. But to do that is going to take rebuilding many of them. And the Congress, while being supportive of the concept, has not provided the funds to do that. But it is an area of agreement. The basics of enforcement, I think, are agreed on. If we go after corporate managers who are exploiting illegals, there's bipartisan support for that. If we're searching everybody equally on the way in, there's bipartisan support for that. So I'll leave it at that because I know time's short.
My last comment, closing comment, is what I would like to see bipartisan support on is using data and facts to inform policy, whatever those policies are. I will leave the policy making up to the policymakers. I'm just a criminologist who studies crime, who happens to study immigration and crime, have done lots of studies on that. My only hope is that the policymakers, whoever they are, whatever side of the aisle they're on, will look at what the research base and the evidence base says on this topic and use that as a key part of the policies that they construct moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I will co-sign. Sorry, just quickly, that the need for better data, especially coming back to the question of whether of like moving beyond apprehensions as the key border metric. There have been a few conversations, and they've all been bipartisan conversations about what better metrics would look like, and those have all kind of stalled out. And so we're in this banana pants world where the thing that we're most focused on in the national discussion is something that's primarily not in the United States control, which is how many people set foot on U.S. soil.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I mean, I think it's a subject probably for another discussion, the issue of what we can do to stand up the rule of law and democracy and prosperity, economic freedom, the types of things in these source countries that would allow people to create a better life there and feel safe there. And, I'm reminded that sometimes people do come to the U.S. and in many ways the grass is greener on the other side, but in other ways they're often surprised by, for example, the cost of living, as Ken referenced earlier. And it's often families who still have loved ones in those other countries, and so the emotional separation, even though it's voluntary in those cases, is certainly something that's very challenging for people to deal with. So we all want a world where there's more countries that rate highly on those elements that make this country such a destination for so many people. So with that, let me turn it back to Khalil to wrap up our program.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you to our speakers, Dr. Charis Kubrin, former acting Deputy Secretary Ken Cuccinelli, and of course Dara Lind from American Immigration Council. Truly appreciate all three of you for weighing in with your expertise and your experience on this very, very important issue. Obviously want to thank our attendees for joining as well. Thank you for sticking in there. Thank you for all the questions. I'm sorry to those we did not get a chance to get to. Unfortunately, an hour is never really enough for these types of conversations, but we do try to limit it within an hour. I want to thank the CCJ team, particularly our comms folks. So thank you, Brian, Rachel, Jennifer. Thank you to our membership team, Andrew and Hannah. And of course, thank you to Centering Justice team, Mark. And of course, the incomparable and invaluable Amanda Acevedo for keeping Mark and myself on track, which is not an easy task. So thank you so much, Amanda. Just a reminder that the event, because it was recorded, it will be posted to our website, and we will be sharing it on social media as well. And again, thank you all for joining, and that concludes our event. Oh, I'm sorry, last thing is any particular questions that folks have, the email to reach out to will be in the comments section on our CCJ LinkedIn page. So please send any comments or questions that we couldn't get to there as well. Thank you again all, and thank you to the CCJ team again.
Thank you.